Ah, finally got Portal 2 in the mail. Alright. Let's check. Alright. Nice. I'm liking what I'm seeing so far. Oh. Alright, let's start thinking of portals here. Oh. Sigh. Return address. Okay. This one is way more pointless and stupid. Yeah, I'm going to listen. Come on.
Hall of Mirrors, Tales of Horror and the Grotesque. Written and performed for podcast by Mike Bennett. This podcast is intended for an adult audience. Hello listeners, and welcome back to the Hall of Mirrors. It's been a bit of a stretch, I know, since the last episode, and I apologise for that. You see, sadly, I have to work for a living. My virtual life, or whatever you want to call this, is only a part-time existence, and it's such a demanding existence at that. Why, I sometimes wonder why I do it. Navigating my way out here to the darkest edge of the internet every week-ish, to come out onto this dismal ruin of a pier, just to show you all a dark time. But then, well, as soon as I see you, with your cheeky face all expectant and excited, your ticket stub clutched so tightly in your sweaty hand, well, I know why I do it. I do it for you, listeners, and when you drop me an email, a friend request, or leave a kind review somewhere, you know, I just want to grab you by those chubby cheeks of yours and yank you through, kicking and screaming into the next episode of the Hall of Mirrors. This week, we're going through the fourth mirror again into part 2 of Hair and Skin. Now, I should warn you, this little trip may cause you to scream out loud, perhaps repeatedly. Oh, don't give me that skeptical look. This one really does have a few shocks on board, so if you're on the bus or train, be warned. I'd hate for you to have an embarrassing moment. So keep the top on that cup of coffee, listeners, lest ye arrive at your destination wearing it. Anyway, last time in Hair and Skin, Part 1, we met millionaire chicken magnate Charles Mason and his own private personal physician, Conrad de Vere. Charles has been having trouble getting his hair transplants to stick, and he's recently learned of a new and highly dangerous way of removing beards from living donors and grafting them onto the heads of desperate bald men such as himself. Conrad was initially skeptical, but as soon as he'd managed to convince Charles to stump up £20,000 for him and for any would-be beard donors he can talk into having their faces removed, why, he seemed to warm to the project no end. We left the men last time just after they'd come to their agreement. Charles was delighted, and Conrad, he had something of a twinkle in his eye, didn't he? I wonder why. Don't you? Ah, look, the mirror has settled upon our entry point this week. A golf course. How nice. Do you play? I personally don't, but I've always wanted to ride around in one of those golf carts. Come on, let's step through the mirror, and maybe we can take one for a spin later. But first, we really do have to enter Hair and Skin, Part 2. Charles was on the golf course when De Vere called him a week later. He was lining up a putt on the 14th hole when the phone rang.
Oh, damn it!
He thrashed the air with his putter and plunged his hand into the pocket of his +4s to retrieve his mobile phone.
Sorry, Sims,
he muttered angrily to his partner.
I told my damn PA that I was to take no calls from anyone except my physician.
Well, perhaps it is your physician, said Sims. Charles pulled out the phone and pushed the answer button.
Yeah, it had better be. Hello?
Mr. Mason, it's Jane. I'm sorry to call you, but Dr. De Vere rang and requested that you call him immediately. He didn't tell me anything more, but he said that you'd know what it was about.
De Vere? Excellent.
Do you have his number, sir?
Yes. Thank you, Jane. Carry on.
He cut off Jane's further apology and hastily selected De Vere's number from his phone's address book.
Sorry about this, Sims, but I have to make this call. Urgent medical business.
Sims waved the apology away. Oh, don't worry, Mason. Please, take your time. As the call connected, Charles sauntered away from Sims with a casual air that he hoped veiled his inner excitement. When De Vere answered, Charles spoke in a low murmur.
De Vere, it's me, Mason. I got your message. What is it?
It concerns the matter of the beard transplants we were discussing recently,
said the doctor.
I've been making some inquiries.
Inquiries? What are you saying, Conrad? Get to the point, man. Are you telling me you found a donor?
Oh, better than that, Charles. I found 2.
2?
Charles squawked.
Why, that's excellent news.
He glanced around at Sims, lowering his volume back to a murmur.
When can we begin the transplant?
Oh, well, hold on, Charles. Not so fast. There's the small matter of 2 individual payments of £20,000 to be made. Neither of the donors is interested in parting with so much as a single hair until they get their hands on the money.
Well, that's no problem. I'll have the money transferred into their accounts as soon as I get back to the office.
De Vere chuckled.
Unfortunately, they don't have bank accounts, Charles. They are, as we predicted they might be, gentlemen of no fixed abode.
So sort them out with accounts, man. You've started a bank account before, haven't you?
I'm afraid it's not that simple, Charles. You see, they don't actually want bank accounts. Unsurprisingly, they don't quite trust me. There's no way they're going to let me anywhere near them with a scalpel unless their pockets are bulging with the promised fee. It's cash up front, Charles. or the beards stay on the cider-drizzled chins of their owners.
But that's preposterous. Nobody walks around with that much money in cash, especially tramps. Where on earth are they going to keep it?
Well, I dare say they'll start their own accounts once they get the money.
Well, can we trust them?
Yes, I think we can. Though, more to the point, do we have a choice? Don't worry, Charles. I'll take precautions to ensure they hold up their end of the bargain.
What kind of precautions?
De Vere chuckled.
I'm a doctor, Charles. I've got a medicine chest full of precautions. Just you leave it all to me.
Charles bit his lip and thought for a moment. Then he said,
Look here, why don't you just tell them who I am? My name should be guarantee enough for anyone. Surely even the derelict classes have heard of Farmer Charlie's fried chicken chunks.
Well, I could mention you to them if you'd like. However, think about it a moment, will you? If the process goes wrong, or one of them should decide to sue you later for ruining their self-confidence or something, the consequences could be disastrous for both of us.
Yes, I see what you mean. So you're keeping our identities strictly hush-hush, eh?
Oh, absolutely hush-hush. I've only ever spoken to them from behind a scarf and dark glasses, and it's a look I intend to stay with. And of course, protecting your anonymity is yet another reason why you're going to have to pay them up front. I mean, supposing they did start bank accounts, and you did transfer the money directly into them. Why, they could trace you as surely as if you'd sent them an invitation to a soiree at your house.
Yes,
muttered Charles, glancing in Sim's direction to make sure the other wasn't listening.
Yes, of course, you're right, Conrad. Very well. Cash, up front. What, in a briefcase or something? That's the usual method of delivery, isn't it?
Yes, I'd say that would do nicely. And I recommend that you use used notes as well. Nothing traceable.
Ingenious, Conrad.
Charles grinned.
You know, you're quite a dark horse, aren't you? Have you ever considered a career in crime?
De Vere gave a dry laugh.
Considered one? My dear Charles, I embarked upon one the moment I took up your offer of a job. All I lack is a mall and a hideout. Oh, correction, I have a hideout. All I need is a mall.
Charles smiled.
Well, with the money you're getting for this, Doctor, you shouldn't have too much trouble locating one.
He glanced over at Sims, who was looking at his watch.
All right, Conrad, I have to go. I'll have the money brought around to you by car as soon as I can get my hands on all those used notes.
Jolly good.
You'll call me when you get the beards?
Of course, Charles. What else am I going to do with them? Try and sell them on eBay?
Charles laughed out loud.
Oh, very good, Conrad. Very droll.
He hung up and strode back to Sims with a renewed spring in his stride.
Sorry to keep you, Sims.
Oh, not at all. Nothing serious, I hope.
No. Just, arranging a boob job for the girlfriend.
Oh, very nice. Expensive procedure?
Yes,
said Charles, lining up his putt.
Absolutely criminal.
He took the shot, and the ball rolled into the hole with a satisfying plop. Four days later, Charles received another call from Dr. De Vere. He spoke into the receiver rapidly, stumbling over his words.
Yeah, how goes it? My solicitors inform me that you received the money. So have you? Have you got the beards?
My dear Charles, calm down,
said De Vere.
I have received the money, and it has been passed on to its new owners.
And the beards? Do you have the beards?
I have the beards, Charles. They were removed without incident and are in excellent health, though I will need you to come over as soon as possible. Obviously, as with any organ transplant, the sooner the procedure begins, the better.
I can be there within the hour,
said Charles.
Excellent,
said De Vere.
I'll have everything ready for you as soon as you arrive. Oh, and Charles?
Yes?
Bring an overnight bag. You'll be in for a day or two.
Yes,
said Charles impatiently.
My PA can take care of all that, just to keep those beards fresh and perky.
He hung up. Of course, Charles. De Vere smiled as he replaced the receiver. Just so. As soon as Charles regained consciousness, his hands groped to touch his head and the new thatch of hair that was, hopefully, sprouting there. Instead, he found a thick turban of bandages. "Ah, good afternoon, Charles," said De Vere cheerfully. "How are you feeling?"
Conrad,
Charles croaked.
how did it go?
He made a face and pointed at his throat.
Water. Glass of water.
De Vere went to Charles's bedside and poured him a glass from the bottle on his nightstand. "Don't excite yourself, Charles. Everything went splendidly." They were in a room in De Vere's practice that was fitted out much like a private room in any hospital. De Vere had wheeled Charles from the operating theatre, a converted bathroom, 2 hours ago. Charles took the water and slurped at it gratefully. Then, eager to talk, he lowered the glass.
You mean I have hair?
De Vere smiled. "Yes, you do indeed." Charles beamed with gratitude.
Oh, my God, Conrad, you're a genius. I knew you could do it. What does it look like?
"Well, right now it looks rather like a tortoiseshell cat that's been crushed by a bus, but that's only to be expected."
Good God! Well, that's only temporary, isn't it?
"Of course. It'll take some time before you'll be able to achieve a natural look. Right now the beards are uneven, both in length and colour, but when they settle down and start growing, you can have them cut and dyed, styled, if you will, to your heart's content."
But how long will that be?
De Vere shrugged. "It's difficult to say. This is a world first, as you know, and I've no precedent to refer to. However, I can say from the innumerable skin grafts I've done in the past that, providing the transplant has been a success, you should be seeing growth there in maybe a week or so."
"And until then?"
"Until then, you rest. Leave the bandages on and do as little as possible. Then I think you should take a holiday or something. Give your body time to heal and to accept its new additions." Charles touched his turban and grinned.
"Oh, I will, Conrad. A holiday sounds just the ticket. I've been thinking of taking a cruise for a while, perhaps on the Queen Mary too. This gives me the perfect excuse."
"Well, that sounds excellent." Charles took another sip of his water. Then, suddenly, he stopped. He lowered the glass to his lap and looked at De Vere with a worried expression.
"And what of the donors, Conrad? How are they doing?"
De Vere smiled. "Oh, they're fine. Don't worry about them. Their operations were a complete success, and they're probably both wondering how they're going to spend their newfound wealth." He chuckled. "Maybe they'll join you on your cruise on the QM2. How odd would that be, The 3 of you at the captain's table. One of them points and says, 'I don't know what it is, but there's something familiar about you.'"
"Don't even joke about it, Conrad. I never want to see or hear from those men again."
And you shan't, Charles. They have no idea of your identity, just as you have no idea of theirs.
Said Charles. That's just as it should be. Well done, Conrad. You've done a marvellous job. Did you get your payment all right?
Yes, thank you. Everything is as it should be, Charles. Now, stop fretting. All this frowning isn't good for your scalp. Relax. Charles sighed and handed his glass to De Vere.
Of course. Relax. Maybe a little sleep. I'm still feeling groggy after the anesthetic.
Yes, said De Vere, helping Charles to ease back into a recumbent position. That'd be just what the doctor ordered. Murmured Charles, closing his eyes.
Good night, Conrad.
Good night, Charles. De Vere went to the bedroom door and laid his hand on the light switch before turning back to where Charles was already slipping into sleep. Pleasant dreams. He turned out the light and closed the door softly behind him. Penelope Gray lay across a king-sized bed in a suite of London's Dorchester Hotel, smoking a cigarette and watching Charles Mason as he giggled and fidgeted on the stool before the dressing-table mirror. He was preening his new hair, striking various poses in his bathrobe and occasionally tearing his eyes away from himself to make sure she was impressed. She wasn't disappointing him, but then feigning admiration for the unimpressive was part of her job. Penelope was a high-class prostitute, and Charles was a regular and valued client.
Do you think it makes me look younger, Penny?
Asked Charles's mirrored reflection. Oh, yes, she lied. Much younger, and more handsome, if such a thing is possible. Charles laughed.
It's amazing, isn't it? New hair, removed from another man and now living, growing on my head.
He turned and faced her, smiling broadly from beneath his amazing new head of hair. He looked ridiculous. One half of his head was a dirty shade of ginger, the other was almost black. His own hair, which grew around the back and sides, was a greying chestnut brown. Yes, said Penelope. It's amazing, Charles. But you say the operation is illegal. Why? Is it dangerous?
Yes, Charles laughed. That's part of it. But it's more to do with my physician's professional status. It's madness, isn't it? A breakthrough like this, possibly worth millions, and the poor chap's got to hide it all behind a veil of secrecy. Tragic, really. Still, he was well paid for it, and I look magnificent. That's the main thing,
What's wrong with his professional status? Is he a trainee or something?
Oh, God, no. The man's one of the best in his field.
Charles eyed his reflection seductively as he spoke, teasing a twist of curly ginger hair into a forelock.
No, darling. Unfortunately, for him, he's been struck off the medical register. That means he can't legally practice medicine. 5 years ago, he was doing a routine facelift that he managed to botch it. He was drunk. Made the person look like a nightmarish clown. He lost his license and was sued for a fortune.
So how come he's doing operations on you?
Because he works for me. I own him. My own private surgeon.
That's handy. Does he do other enhancements? Maybe you could arrange for him to give me 1 or 2 on the house. Charles's reflection grinned at her lecherously.
You don't need enhancements, Penny. And when you do, well...
He went back to admiring his hair in the mirror.
We'll see.
What Charles really meant was that she wouldn't be on his list of lady friends any more, but why spoil the moment? Oh, Charles, you certainly know the way to a girl's heart.
I'm not interested in the way to a girl's heart, lovey. I'm interested in the way to her sweet little arse.
Why, Charles, do I have a sweet little arse?
No, you don't.
said Charles, getting up and letting his toweling robe fall open.
"You've got a sweet big arse, like a lovely big peach that I want to come over and sink my teeth into."
Penelope chuckled coquettishly and rolled onto her front. "Oh, Mr. Mason, you're insatiable. It must be the new hair."
"Yes,"
said Charles, sitting down on the corner of the bed and kneading Penelope's bottom like fresh dough.
"Yes. I think you may be right there, Penny. Maybe I did get something else draining into me from it. Some youthful vigour seeping down into my balls and keeping Mr. Peckerwood up all night,
He leaned forward, climbing over her and easing himself down so his erection pressed against her buttocks. Penelope didn't notice it, preoccupied as she was with the difficulty of breathing beneath his enormous weight. She groaned and managed to make it sound like pleasure. "Oh, Mr. Peckerwood." Charles grinned and buried his face in her hair, nuzzling at her neck like an Alsatian.
"You gorgeous tart."
Penelope gritted her teeth, sucked in a breath, and managed to squirm her way around onto her back. Then, smiling sensuously, she lifted her hands to touch his face and run her fingers through his new hair. It was coarse and wiry, and its touch filled her with revulsion. "Oh, it's so soft," she purred.
"Yes,"
Charles chuckled.
"Unlike Mr. Peckerwood."
He kissed her, his tongue slipping into her mouth like an eel. She returned his passion with professional enthusiasm as he shifted his full weight on top of her. "Oh, Charles," she moaned as the mattress rose around her. "You big, sexy man."
"Yes,"
said Charles.
"Oh, yes."
A fortnight later, Charles was lying beside the pool of the Queen of the Aegean. He had followed De Vere's advice about taking a holiday and had finally decided upon a cruise around the Greek islands. He sighed and touched his hair lovingly. Yes, a holiday was just the thing he and his new hair needed. He needed time to relax and generally recuperate, and his hair needed time to settle in and take root, time to flourish under the warmth of the Aegean sun. Charles didn't get out in the sun too often, and his white skin was dazzling beneath an even coating of factor 30 sun oil. The whiteness of his body was a marked contrast to the all-over dark brown colouring of his hair. He'd had it dyed just before he flew out to meet the ship. It hadn't caused any problems. On the contrary, it had, he believed, been a major factor in his wily seduction of young Victoria. He smiled at her as she came towards him from the bar. She had his martini in one hand, and whatever ghastly Technicolor concoction she was drinking in the other. She smiled at him, her eyes concealed behind her sunglasses as she sat down on the sun lounger next to his. "Here you are," she said, handing him the martini. He lowered his copy of yesterday's edition of the Times and took the drink.
"Thank you, my dear."
No doubt she was just another gold digger. She was probably hoping that he'd propose to her in the next few days. A rich old fool, just dying to get married to a pretty young thing like her. Well, he thought, eyeing the tops of her bikini-bound breasts, she had another think coming. He'd enjoy her for the duration of the cruise, then discard her. "Do you want me to oil you up, Charlie?" said Victoria. "Maybe you could roll over and I could rub some into your back."
No, thank you, Vicky. I can't read my paper if I'm lying on my front, and a fellow's got to keep up with current events. Don't you agree?"
"Oh, I don't like current events." They're always going on about war and politics. I like to read about people like Posh Spice and Brittany. Do you like Posh Spice, darling? Charles grimaced inwardly. What utter drivel the woman talked.
Yes. It's charming.
No, Victoria laughed. It's not an it, it's a she. She used to be a Spice Girl, silly. Charles managed to smile.
Oh, I see. Of course.
He took a long drink from his martini. I'm going in for a swim, said Victoria, running a hand up his oily thigh. You coming in as well? He smiled and raised his paper.
Not really my cup of tea, Vicky. You go, though, and when you get out, I'll rub a fresh coating of oil all over that sexy little body of yours.
She laughed. Ooh, saucy. I'll just make it a quick tip, then. Charles grinned, the sight of her sashaying bottom sustaining his smile as she got up and walked to the pool's edge. She gave him a wave, then disappeared with a small splash, and Charles returned to his newspaper. He was just about to reach down to pick up his drink when, turning the page, he saw something that caused him to sit suddenly upright. Beneath the headline, Police Release Picture of London Homeless Killer, was an artist's impression of a man's face, a face Charles recognized, perhaps only because it had been on his mind so much of late. Despite the lack of general resemblance, there was something unmistakable about the eyes, and of course, the beard.
Oh, my God,
he murmured.
De Vere?
His eyes darted to the story and scanned for details. The text read, Police today issued an artist's impression of a man they wish to speak to in connection with the disappearances of 3 homeless men in the London area. The description was given to the police by a man who was attacked last night near King's Cross Station. Richard Croft, 32, a homeless man who lives in the King's Cross area, claims that his attacker approached him and offered him a large sum of money in exchange for a favour. Mr. Croft presumed that the man was seeking sexual favours and declined. However, his attacker persisted, seizing Croft by the arm and pulling him into an alley and then attempting to render him unconscious with a handkerchief soaked in what Mr. Croft believes may have been chloroform. Croft managed to wrestle himself free and call for help, which caused his attacker, a Caucasian man in his late 40s with a beard and very dark eyes, to run off. The incident has been linked to the disappearance of Colin Bale, 20, and Stephen Tweed, 40, both of whom vanished on the night of March 17th, and Dennis Wilkins, 26, who went missing on March 29th. Charles lowered his paper numbly. His hand went to his head and touched the new hair that grew there. His scalp seemed suddenly to tingle, as if the new skin were trying to remove itself from him. He felt a sudden wave of nausea.
He killed them, he thought. De Vere murdered the men he was supposed to pay and kept the money for himself. And now he's going into business, killing homeless men and hacking their faces off to graft onto the heads of other men. Men like me. He swung his legs over the side of the sun lounger as a cold sweat prickled across his brow. He could feel his breakfast rising in his throat, and he clamped his hand to his mouth. He got to his feet and hurriedly stumbled across the deck to the side of the ship, grabbing at the handrail and thrusting his head out over the starboard side, just in time to vomit his kippers back into the sea. Victoria Barnes stood outside cabin 44 and knocked again at the door. Charles! Charlie! Are you okay, darling? It's me, Vicky. Charlie! Oh, speak to me, darling. You're scaring me. There was no reply. She hadn't seen Charles since yesterday morning. She'd been in swimming for maybe 10 minutes, and when she got out, he'd vanished.
She'd called at his cabin, but it had been locked and there'd been no reply. She'd then proceeded to search the entire ship, but she hadn't been able to find a trace of him anywhere, not so much as a tuft of his strange hair transplant, which had always seemed rather unstable and about ready to drop out at any minute. And so she'd given up her search, left with the only conclusion that at that time made any sense to her. He'd given her the slip. But after a few cocktails and a lot of lavished male attention in the first-class bar last night, she'd come to doubt that. She'd woken up this morning with a hangover and a terrible certainty. Charles had fallen overboard, dragged to the bottom of the Aegean by the considerable weightiness of his wallet. She'd decided to come down straight away and give his cabin door one final hammering before going to the captain and telling him her fears. "Charlie!" she said to the cabin door. "If you're in there, please speak to me, darling. I'm worried about you." Silence. "Charles! Charles, if you don't say something, I'm going to have to go to the captain and tell him you've fallen overboard. So if you haven't fallen overboard, say so, darling."
"No,"
a voice from the other side of the door suddenly replied.
"No, don't do that."
"Charlie!" she cried. "Charlie! Why didn't you answer me? I've been worried sick."
"I just want to be alone. I've got a migraine and I'm just lying here in the dark, hoping it will go away."
"Oh, Charlie," she said with a keening, childish lilt. "You poor thing. Is there anything I can do for you?"
"No, please. Just leave me alone."
Victoria stepped back from the door. She hesitated a moment before answering quietly. "Okay, Charlie." She thought about adding something kinky, but decided to leave it. "Call me when you feel better, yeah?" Inside his cabin, Charles spoke with his face pressed against the cabin door.
"Yes,"
he lied.
"I'll call you."
"All right, darling." Charles remained pressed and listening to the door. Finally, the damn woman was going away. When he was sure she'd gone, he let out the breath he'd been holding and turned back into the darkened room. He wasn't lying when he'd said he had a migraine. His head was splitting. The worst headache he'd ever had, and certainly the most frightening. The pain had come on immediately after he'd been sick the previous day, and he'd quickly returned to his cabin. He was no stranger to migraine, and knew there was little to do but wait it out in a darkened room. However, this time the pain was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It seemed to be located at two specific points on either side of his scalp, as if each hemisphere of his brain were hemorrhaging acid at the inner wall of his skull. Charles had tentatively reached up to massage the points of pain, pushing his fingers through the thick, coarse hair that now flourished there, only to suddenly recoil when he felt two hideous swellings on the surface of his scalp. He'd pulled his fingers away as if his scalp had been on fire.
"Brain tumours," he thought. "I've got brain tumours. Somehow the transplant has gone wrong, and now I've got a pair of brain tumours the size of lemons bursting out of my head."
His first reaction had been to call De Vere, but then he checked himself. De Vere was a murderer, wasn't he? The last person he wanted to see was De Vere, and yet, who else could he turn to? The ship's doctor? And have to answer questions about the transplants that would surely implicate him as an accomplice of De Vere's? No, that wasn't an option either. All he could do was wait. Wait and hope that the swellings would go down of their own accord. Not tumours, just side effects, temporary aberrations, maybe some kind of cysts or blisters filled with blood or pus or something like that. They'd either simply go down or burst. The thought of them bursting had caused him to be overcome by fresh nausea, and he'd staggered to the sink to vomit. And now, as soon as he was certain that Victoria had gone, he moved unsteadily to his bed and sat down. The pain in his head hadn't abated in the least, and the cysts hadn't gone down. What was more, they'd begun to itch, maddeningly, and Charles was terrified that if he scratched them, they would burst. Warily, he reached up and brushed his fingertips lightly over the swellings. The itch raged at his touch, but he had to continue, gritting his teeth as his fingers explored, probing for the source of the itch. And then he noticed something new. Along the ridge of each cyst was what felt like a line of baldness, and it was from these lines of almost pouting bare skin that the itchiness blazed. Charles resisted the urge to sink his nails into them and scratch for all he was worth. Instead, he caressed them, both soothing and aggravating them at the same time. Then a small laugh of relief broke from him. The transplant was failing. That was it. He was going to lose his new hair, and that would be the end of it. And the beards, the severed faces of De Vere's mutilated victims, would cease to... Charles's thoughts were suddenly cut off as two simultaneous waves of pain poured through his head and down his spine like torrents of molten lead. He screamed, almost falling from the bed and clapping his hands over the swellings as again dual waves of agony racked his body. Charles fell sideways onto the bed, his hands coming away from his head, sticky with a warm wetness. He looked at his palms and stifled a scream. A viscous substance covered them, mucus-like, foam-flecked and stained with red and black gouts of blood.
"Oh, merciful God! No!"
Charles whimpered.
"They've burst!"
he thought.
"The tubers have burst! I'm going to die! Here, alone in this cabin!"
Charles touched the swellings. He felt the substance wet under his palm. His new hair was slippery with it, and the cysts, blisters, or whatever they were, had split. Each had burst open like an overripe peach, and something, brain juice, was oozing out directly from them. Charles's fingers fluttered over the openings, the viscid liquid coming away on his fingertips like treacle. Strangely, he noticed, the pain seemed to be abating, as if soothed by his touch. His breath was coming in snuffling, snot-lace gasps, and he held it as, with trembling fingers, he tenderly stroked the openings. Then he released his breath in a little yelp as he felt a new sensation, a tingle of pleasure. He stroked again, and waves of almost erogenous pleasure rippled through him. He moaned, his fingers caressing the wounds and probing at the openings, parting the edges and finding a hard, unyielding surface within. He opened his eyes suddenly.
"Oh, my God," he thought. "I'm rubbing my skull."
But it wasn't smooth as a skull should be. It was uneven, bumpy at more or less regular intervals, more like rubbing the surface of... It was then that the hard surface beneath Charles's fingertips began to part. Charles gasped and withdrew his fingers, listening as the twin swellings hissed and bubbled as though air were escaping through them. Was this it? He thought. Was this the release of whatever poison had been causing his head to literally split with pain? Cautiously, Charles reached again to touch the swellings. Just above their oozing ruptures, he could indeed feel warm air coming in short, steady draughts, like exhalations, he realized. His fingers stroked the wet openings and probed cautiously inside, but something was wrong with the right side. The hole was deeper. The skull had opened, and... It was then that his skull bit him. Charles screamed and yanked his fingers free, sending a wave of pain through his head.
"Hello, Charles.
hissed a voice that seemed to come from deep in the right hemisphere of his brain. Charles turned to the right, trying to find the owner of the voice, but there was no one there.
Charles!
Another voice sang, this time from the left. Again, Charles looked for a speaker and found none.
Looking for someone, Charles?
Asked the voice on the right. It sounded as if it were speaking through a mouthful of phlegm.
Take a look in the mirror, Charles,
said the other voice. Charles sat up and stared into the mirror that faced the bed from above the dressing table. He was quite alone.
Lean forward, Charles, said the voice on the right. Move closer to the mirror and have a good look.
Charles eased forward, stumbling from the bed to the floor. He crawled over to the mirror and placed his hands on the edge of the dressing table. As he rose slowly, head tilted towards the mirror, he knew, even though it was almost insane to contemplate, he knew what he would see there. The beards, the lip-like openings, the breathing, and the bite. Charles's blood-soaked reflection rose into the mirror and screamed. Oh dear,